On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Ben Garvey. He is a senior engineering manager at Betterment. We're going to be talking about velocity versus quality and how Ben approaches ensuring the team's delivering and meeting goals and milestones, but also shipping high quality code and reducing technical debt. That'd be the worst thing, is to deliver fast and increase technical debt. And Ben, I'm excited to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm Ben. I work at Betterment. We're the first robo-advisor, and it's a software that helps you invest and save your money so you can live better. And I run a team of engineers that works on that product.
Awesome. I know in talking to you, was super excited to kind of understand your views on the topic of this podcast, and kind of to set up the rest of the show. Let's talk about how your team is set up, what agile practices and ceremonies you guys are leveraging, and then we kind of dive into the core of that velocity versus quality issue.
Yeah, so I think we're definitely an agile shop, where most places are these days. We have our daily stand-ups, and we use a 2-week sprint and have a retro at the end every time and try to track our milestones. We run primarily in that agile methodology, like using a Kanban board. And this is a thing that I've worked with for a long time through my days in engineering in tech, and also when I worked in industrial manufacturing for 10 years and sort of took some of the manufacturing stuff from Toyota and other places that have sort of transformed American manufacturing in the last 20 years to sort of bring that to sort of the tech side of things, which has been interesting. So we talk about how to keep shipping good code, right? With also maintaining quality. It's like an extra level of urgency for us because we're a highly regulated industry, right? We have to make sure that all the stuff that goes out doesn't have disastrous impacts for our clients and for us. And so, but I think that's kind of true everywhere. It's especially true for us. We have special regulations around it. But any company doesn't want to release bad code. They don't want to release bugs, but they also still want to move fast. So how do you balance this thing between team velocity and quality? And I feel like this is a thing that we talk about, but I actually think it's almost like a false dilemma, right? Because the idea that there's a trade-off between each other, I don't think that that's necessarily true. Because if you look at the life cycle of a pull request, right, there's some requirements that have to be gathered for this change. There's the engineer sort of has to review the changes that have to get made. They sort of have to write the code, right? Run all the tests against that code to make sure that it hasn't broken anything else. Put that code up for a pull request for code review. And at Betterment, one of the ways we sort of maintain quality is we have this concept of 2 different types of code review. We have a domain code review and platform, right? So domain would be what does this feature do what it's supposed to do? Does it fix what it's supposed to fix? Does it add what it's supposed to add, right? Does this change do what it's intended? The platform is where there's an expert in this particular technology, whether it's Java, Ruby, JavaScript, whatever that technology is, there's an expert that's weighing in and say, okay, this is done in the correct standards and forms and practices of this sort of technology as we've defined it as a company and a team. And so it requires us to get sign off from 2 different engineers, any code change that we make. And so once it's put up for code review, you have this wait time for 1 or 2 reviewers to pick up this code and sort of look at and do that review. And then the time for them to write their comments and changes, the person to sort of wait to pick it back up again when they're free again to make those changes, and then put them back up for code review again, then back for the reviewers to pick it up and look at it. And then a time for the engineer who wrote all the code to merge that code in, right? So this is a huge timeline of stuff that's happening, right? And not all that time has anything to do at all with quality. So there's a necessity for the wait times between things in order to do that code review. But that wait time actually doesn't impact quality whatsoever, right? The review obviously impacts quality. The writing of the code impacts quality, but there's the requirements gathering, they have an indirect impact in quality. But if you can look at that whole timeline, there are huge parts of that timeline that have nothing to do with what the impact on quality is. So if you can reduce those, and they're usually the longest ones, these wait times in between people picking up the pull request, that's where you can make those times back. So we've developed a bunch of practices to try to shorten those wait times during the life cycle of a code review. And there's a whole suite of things you can do depending on how the team's operating and what they're doing.
And I guess this would be a good question to ask you. When you're defining, velocity, we can talk about measuring velocity and how you guys look at it. And when you're looking at quality, obviously, quality in the quality of the actual physical code written, how efficient it is, how close it's written to, functional requirements, to technical specifications. There's tons of different areas of quality. Are there any particular areas of quality that you guys are looking at? I guess you guys have a very, stringent process, being obviously SEC regulated as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, it depends on what part of the code base you're looking at. But like, my team is mostly writing like the people that I work directly with, mostly working on one of our product lines called Betterment for Advisors, which is a product line that's an aggregation level on top of the retail product that allows advisors to use our, robo investing platform for their clients and sort of automate some of the back end office stuff and investing capabilities. And so what's interesting about quality is like you check with that. So like there are ways you can sort of, measure quality, but really what you're trying to do as well is like make any like defect in quality sort of as painless as possible, right? And the ways you do that are having a good feature flag system, right? So when new features go out, new products go out, you can put them into production and deploy them to a way that only we can see them, right? We can see the changes, we can turn them on and off for specific test accounts that we can take a look at in prod with real data and see what's actually happening and what it looks like. 2 or 3 days a week, we'll have a finished meeting where we go through with the product manager, with the designer, show them any features that are about to be shipped or ones that have just recently shipped. Take a look at that, and they can make pixel level decisions about whether quality, if it looks as good as it's supposed to or not. We test the features, we test different things and the outcomes and make sure that all those states end up where they're supposed to be. So that's like a way we sort of have, we can ship stuff to production, but still make it so that we can only have it available to us, right? Or like a small set, and we can roll things out to a specific number of users in like a rolling basis to make sure that like any regression that does get out into the world, we can quickly roll it back and hide that from anyone else.
How mature is your CI/CD process? Just to kind of put some context around, a little bit of what you guys are doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think our definitely compared to any other teams I've worked on at Betterment, our CI is very good. Like there's no code that ever hits production that hasn't been run through our entire test suite. It's all automatic. So you can't merge code until it's been approved, gets the green check mark from, we use Circle CI for all that. And our test coverage is pretty great. And again, my team is primarily working in Ruby on Rails. And I feel like the dev tooling for Ruby on Rails is just like a really great state in the industry where all the stuff you need to write tests and everything is sort of, pretty painless at this point.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And yeah, I mean, definitely with Rails, it's a far more mature area. It was maybe even decade ago. When you're looking at the scenario where, and I don't know if this is something you run into, but do you guys run into a scenario where the product team has a feature or something that needs to be adjusted to the roadmap quicker and that's popping up on your horizon, maybe unanticipated?
Oh, sure. I mean, like the whole point of working in Agile, so you can take advantage of those, right? That you don't have to have planned the thing out 2 months ago in order to get into prod today. Like we're smarter today than we were 2 months ago. So like when you do any kind of project, you want to slice it up small. As this goes back to my idea of like how to reduce those wait times too, right? So if you can make small pull requests, they're easier to code review. So people are more likely to pick them up. If you write good descriptions of the code, you're more likely to jump in and review that code as opposed to continue working on what you're working on yourself. I think the idea that like when you do a project, you should don't go from point A, to point B. You should like take a bunch of steps along the way because probably where you end up is somewhere around C, but you don't really know where that is yet. And that will help you get there quicker as opposed to going from A to B to C. And the nice thing about that is that you're able to like take advantage of the knowledge that you've gained as you've gone along the way.
So I guess, in those scenarios where something, comes up on the radar and you have to look at, the current team's velocity, how do you sit back and, look at what you can deliver in a certain time? Let's say, product does come to you, and obviously with, I don't know if you guys are actually, putting, stories together and going actually through a backlog or I mean, you mentioned Kanban, but nonetheless, either way, both mechanisms can support it. But when something comes up that's not, let's say, in the cycle and you've got to deliver, and obviously you're going to take a hit to velocity, how do you approach solving that? Because obviously you don't want to push the team too fast, and then quality is something we've talked about. You have a lot of checkpoints, and that's coming.
Yeah, I would say even in that case, if a new requirement comes up that the team is required to do, that actually is not impacting velocity at all. I guess it depends on what your definition of velocity is. Because if your definition of velocity is to hit every milestone that you've ever set, right, then yeah, it's gonna change the roadmap, right? So, but if you have added new requirements, and you're doing them, then that actually isn't affecting velocity. In the same sense, like you could be hitting all the milestones that you've set, and your velocity could be less than it was previously because you just weren't ambitious enough in that sprint. And I think the way I sort of quantify velocity on my team, and this isn't even universal to Betterment or any other places, but like I just look at merges. So like there are tons of bad metrics you can use for engineers, right? No one in 2020 is ever saying that lines of code is ever a good metric. In fact, most engineers would brag about the number of lines of code they've deleted in a month, more than they would in the one lines they've added. But I think merges are like the atomic unit of something that is like a piece of value, right? So whether it's documentation upgrades, whether it's a small bug fix, whether it's a large pull request that has, a lot of features into it, the closer we can get to this, Toyota concept of single part flow, right? Where you have like the ideal scenario would be one line of code going at a time, all the way from my computer all the way to production, right? You can look at a line of code and understand completely what it does. Every time you add another line of code, you sort of reduce that ability to understand what it does. And so you're at the perfect level of like quality and velocity at that one line of code. But it's kind of like too extreme of an ideal, but it's like sort of an ideal that we shoot for. But like I will look at the number of merges that my team does in a week period and sort of use that as my barometer for what the team velocity is. So if we add new requirements, but we're still at like X number of pull requests in the week, then it's like, okay, then that's what the team's capacity is. If we're far exceeding that number, then I might look into the work to see if like why it was that shape, and I'll look at the number of the repos that it was merged into and sort of understand what's happening. If it goes way below, then I will look into sort of what's happening there on an individual level and see like what's going on with people. But like for the most part, I think it's an easier way to measure team velocity. And the thing is, you can game it, right? You can game that system. You could make an update to the README of the repo every day, but hey, what team wouldn't want to improve their like velocity of documentation as well? The only assumption you have to make is that like that all the code's all reviewed and like we want it, right? We want this change, and everyone, at least two other people have signed off that we do want it, so I don't have to worry about that part of it. But I do, so that's merges per week is kind of the team velocity from my standpoint.
Yeah, that's actually interesting because obviously, like using traditional user points, it's I guess when you can correctly, your team will, start understanding what that means to them once they've actually normalized and they're delivering. But still, to me, user points is still a little, kind of generic. I think it's difficult. I think merges is interesting because I think the other thing you get to, which I think I had somebody else talking about this before, was getting to predictability and understanding your velocity via predictability, meaning how many merges can they do, because I have now historical basis as maybe even a better view of velocities, because then you can have an expected, 2 week, whatever it is, 25, 30, 50 merges in per developer, per team, whatever it is, I don't know. But I think that's an interesting use case of a bar that does help the team actually really, obviously if they're not gaming it, which you said, but you have two people checking code afterwards. So there's a lot of eyes on this either way.
Without code review, it doesn't work at all. You can't use it. But I think the story pointing and card counting and all the different systems that people use, like they have a value. And I think some of the things I like about those systems is like they require us as a team to think deeply about how things are carded up and broken up. But I think also in the end of the day, they're estimates, right? And the estimates are just notoriously bad. They're always off, usually in the wrong way by, 2 or 3 times what we think they are. Because we sort of think about the ideal case, the happy path of how that code's going to go and how that week's going to go. Rarely is as simple as we think it's going to be. We're optimistic about ourselves.
Yeah, if the team is executing together for a while, I think you definitely can hone in on predictability. And in my day, I was a Scrum Master, and this was before people could really separate the concept of project management out from Scrum. And you go through the estimation process and you go through user points, and somebody would say, well, are you pretty confident? And I go, when the contractor comes and tells you your bathroom remodel is going to cost you $4,000 and it starts becoming 5 and 6, you were pretty confident in signing that statement of work up front, but there's only so much until he's in there and he realizes you have a little bit of rot behind the wall, and all of a sudden, and I was like, you're asking me to be confident before we've put the first shovel in and taken down the first wall. And I was like, there's only so much you can do here.
That's definitely true, because sometimes you don't have a good concept of what you're building until you start making it and start building it and working on it. That's that analogy, I think. It works for the most part, but I think I'd be pretty mad if I hired a contractor for $4,000 to remodel the bathroom and it became 6.
Well, I think I agree, except when they pull out some of the wall and they realize, oh, you have a little damage to something back there, and that scope creep, right? Anytime you bring a contractor in of any kind, software, plumbing, remodeling, anything, there's always that you got to keep that scope creep in check. I guess it's a conflict of interest, as it were, but
yeah. But mentioning the scope creep, I'm a big fan of the sort of, fixed deadline, negotiable scope idea, right? Because I feel like there needs to be sort of like some sort of end date.
Yes.
When this thing's up, because there's always more tests, there's always more code cleanup, there's always more refactoring you could do on anything. And I feel like if you have that sort of focusing factor of that date, it helps. And then you can always decide to reboot the project, right? You can always decide to either with different people or the same folks, just do a version 2 of that feature and keep working on it. But like redeciding it as a team is a good exercise to do to make sure that it's worth it and not worth moving to something else.
Yeah, and I guess to that point, when you do see scope creep, right? Obviously, your team might want to take on more, right? They through the estimation phase, they might decide they're going to try to get a little aggressive. They feel they want to maybe make up ground. How do you view that? Like, I mean, obviously, you're watching this, you see the process, you're using a number of merges as a good gauge. But do you step in and be like, hey guys, you guys are overcommitting. Like I can see it already. I know you're trying to make up. You guys are trying to deliver more. Does that happen for you?
I think the idea of scope creep is not necessarily like, it's usually not the team pushing to do more, right? The team is trying to execute on the requirements. In those cases, it would typically be like the product manager or the executive or CEO, or someone coming in and saying like, hey, this is something that we need. And like, we could do X more if we just had this thing, right? So like, I think it's totally normal and happens all the time, right? So like, I think the velocity that I sort of track in merges is less of a like, for a predictability factor. It's more of like a tool that I use to make sure the team is operating efficiently and working well together, right? If I see changes happening big time, then I think that there's something that might need to look into and address. But I think the predictability thing is still hard because even though you have this metric of how well the team's operating, it still doesn't necessarily predict when the job's going to be done because it's still based on an estimate of how many cards and how many merges we'd have to take to get there. I think that's always sort of in flux, and I think it's difficult to do that. But if you sort of set short-term goals, like so we do every 2 weeks, we have like a list of like 10 things that the team is going to get done. And usually every project has like, if we haven't gotten these things done in the sprint, then the whole thing is going to shift another week because we haven't accounted for that extra time.
Yep. That's what I was alluding to is, you get that unexpected, memo, email, note saying, hey, we need to include this sooner. And, obviously the teams, most people want to react and, tackle more. And it's always a slippery slope because, the quality piece that we talk about, good, fast, cheap. There's a couple of, you could have 2 of the 3, and it's very hard to increase speed without.
But I look at software and I think software is like the thing that has started beating that, right? It's like, that was like an old saying that, about projects and things like that, but software gets cheaper to run all the time. It's faster to run all the time. I'm not going to say software today is better than it used to be, but in some cases it's better, right? And I think like you have to be careful because that danger is as a way you can sort of like talk yourself out of doing better, right? We can always be better. We can always write better software. We can always get better at our tooling. We can always get faster at what we're doing and more focused. And I think software is like a almost like remarkable technology that we've sort of developed over the last, I guess it's coming up, 70 years, 80 years, however long software has been written, that allows us to be better, faster, and cheaper versions of ourselves. Cheap is relative too, because like we're hopefully all making more money than we did at the start of our careers, but like we're probably generating even more value for the companies that we work for or the products we build ourselves.
And that's actually a really great observation. You are right. The cost of actual creation is going down. I mean, you don't have to procure physical servers like you did 20 years ago and have somebody actually host them and all that stuff. So if you were to look back, just a curious question, early in your career in terms of, maybe early days of developing, and you're comparing to what you're doing now, do you see that leap forward of that, being able to deliver better and cheaper and faster?
Yeah, I mean, like we were talking about CI earlier, right? The idea that like I can have a giant test suite that I don't even have to run on my local machine. I can run the local tests that I'm pretty sure that I've modified or had to have changes, and I can push them up. And like some other computer is going to run all these tests for me on a parallelized hardware. They can crank out the test that would take me maybe a half hour to run, can run in just a few minutes. On that's faster, right, for development, and that's also better because it's ensuring that any changes I made are not interfering with the changes of the other X number of engineers on my team, which is a lot. The testing now is so much better than it was in the old days. Like we just didn't have it back when I started.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the idea of a full regression test suite now versus trying to establish the old SDET role 10 years ago is a complete shift in capabilities and I guess the quality. I think that's where the quality piece is. I don't think it's as much about code quality anymore as it is maybe other components. Obviously, you still have bugs, But I think there's other quality components in there that start creeping in just that are outside of these particular things.
Yeah, also a continuous delivery too. It's not like we're not doing a a yearly release that comes in a box that we have tested as best we can, but we don't know. And if anything is broken, it'll take us a patch or something afterwards. It's I'm shipping changes myself sometimes 10 times in one day that goes directly out to the users of the software, and they're able to have it immediately. And then I have a high confidence that my small change is not going to break things going out, because we're just continuous delivery of that software gives us a high confidence that it works.
Yeah, and I think that's really the interesting part of the actual delivery component now is that I think when you couple CI and CD together, I guess even if you do get a defect, they're smaller, they're quicker to be able to be addressed and identified. And I think the impact is definitely much more finite than it was maybe 10 years ago.
There are some things though that I think are like, I think you used to be able to sort of you just had to run software on your local machine, and you kind of understood the way you were using it, interacting, it was the same way someone else was, right? That if someone installed the software, they'd use it pretty much in the same way you were. Whereas now you're running it locally. It's an approximation of how it runs in the cloud. There are different tooling set up. There's different build processes that have to run. And I think we sort of do have this more complicated environment of how the software gets run. So I think that's something like I enjoy understanding the entire stack of how it's working, and like your mental model of how everything gets deployed can sometimes be confusing at times, but I think it's worthwhile to try to understand how it actually works.
Absolutely. Awesome, man. I was cognizant of your time. I think we keep chatting away, but I appreciate you being on. Let me ask you a question. I mean, you mentioned, Betterment, and you guys are obviously, have just shot up. I mean, you guys are doing really well. How's your team growing? Like, are you guys actually in like high growth mode now, given, where we're at in the world?
I don't know the total number of employee history over the time, but I think we're over 300 employees. We're based mostly in New York, but we have offices in Philly and Denver. But it's been a really great experience and a great ride with this company.
Absolutely. If somebody does want to reach out to you, I mean, you mentioned your guys are Ruby on Rails. If somebody wants to reach out, because they're a Rails engineer, they're maybe looking, is that something?
Yeah, our core tech is Ruby on Rails. We're Java. Also, on the mobile side, we've moved hardcore into Flutter. So if anyone's any Flutter engineers out there, or people are excited about mobile development, check out our careers page at betterment.com/careers. Lots of openings and lots of fun in 2021.
Awesome. And we'll link your, we'll include your LinkedIn as well. If somebody has anything to follow up or wants to reach out to you regarding, working at Betterment, we'll include that in the show notes. But thanks for being on. Thanks for spending time with us and chatting.
Yeah, thanks, Mir.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode, guys. I appreciate you guys listening, and always ask for two things. One is keep subscribing. It's been increasing steadily, the listenership, and I mentioned every podcast episode. It's just because I sometimes wondered when we started this, would anyone listen? And when you get feedback and messages, you're like, wow, people are, and it's kind of humbling. And the other thing is topics. I'm always looking for another topic idea, something else we should explore. We're having amazing, talented individuals coming on, talking about different components and in terms of engineering management and different aspects. Love more topics if you could. But until next time, thanks.